What is happening, I think, is that this is turning out to be a leveraging proposition. In other words, for instance, huge as this money is, several billions a year going into K-12 policy, but that number is very small compared to the total national expenditure on K-12 education. And for instance, when I remarked to the Gates Foundation that I think it's having a very dramatic policy impact, their response, and this is from a junior member of the staff, is, well, how could that be? Because we provide only less than 1%. I'm not sure what it is of the total expenditures. It's foolish to say that we could have an impact with that level of expenditure. I think that's a foolish response. In this case, it was a naive response, I think. Because of the power of large amounts of money to leverage policy decisions, what counts is the impact that the funds have on policy decision-making. And there, I think it's very, very substantial indeed. Most of the state and federal money, local money that goes into it is to pay people's salary, for operating expenses, for building buildings, all those kinds of things. None of this money goes to that. This money goes to train teachers, to train principals, to establish new forms of testing and new standards. It goes to encourage the development of charter schools. In other words, to leverage decisions on educational policy, which in themselves, by the way, I think will have a determining impact on what happens. And I think in the K-12 area that has already happened. So for instance, this consortium of funders, Gates, Broad, Walton, Bloomberg, others, Dell, has had a dramatic impact on promoting the charter school movement. Charter schools are public schools that escape the normal constraints of public school systems, although they remain public schools. They're ordinarily not unionized. They don't have to play by all the rules. They have greater freedom of action. And that's a very promising development in a lot of ways. But it's not at all clear that we're getting the results from those schools that were promised. The jury is out. I think the best evidence so far is that they're not really doing better than public schools, although individual chains of charter schools do. But that may change and it may get better. But it's an important policy initiative, and I think it wouldn't have gone this far without private funding. The same thing is true, for instance, with teacher training. Organizations like Teach for America are the angels, the darlings of these big funders. So are certain chains of charter schools, like the KIPP schools, for instance, one could name. Others, academies to train. The Broad, for instance, the Broad Foundation specializes in training principals and superintendents, and they're creating a feedback loop of personnel to run this new system. I think there's a darker side to it because there is an anti-union element to the reform movement, because unions are correctly seen as standing in the way of change. And one way to make change with charter schools is to avoid unions. And that may make sense from the point of view of a particular policy change you want to make. It's not so advantageous if you're a lifelong career teacher. That's another important issue. But that's an example of how they make these funds work. Or at the federal level, another example would be Ernie Duncan, who is currently the U.S. Secretary of Education, is deeply embedded, I would say, in this philanthropic network. He was the superintendent of schools in Chicago, where, if not the largest, one of the largest funders of his reform efforts there was the Gates Foundation. So he has been working with them for a very long time. When he came to Washington, his first act was to hire some Gates Foundation program officers to be chief of staff and other principal officers in the U.S. Department of Education. There are several working there right now. And not too surprisingly, under his direction, the Department of Education has dramatically turned in the direction of these philanthropic policy, the best example of which would be the Race to the Top. And the basic principles of that program are, in effect, the principles of this philanthropic consortium that I've spoken about. So, that's how it works. Was all that intended? I couldn't prove it. Is that the fact? I think, yes, it's demonstrable that that's the fact. So it's really very important. And it will happen it is happening in other areas too.